All right, let's now talk about theories of international relations, as I previously mentioned. So this corresponds to the third chapter in your textbook, and so one of the things that I hope we are going to accomplish by this is thinking about international relations from a theoretical perspective. In other words, how do we group classes of phenomena so that we can understand them better? If we see a war, how can we make a statement about wars? If we see a country that is economically developing, can we make a determination as to the factors that are relevant to that development? And if someone asked us to help a country develop, how do we do that? And so we also will be able to analyze contemporary international relations events using different theoretical perspectives. So, for example, how would you explain US actions in, or why is the US interested in Ukraine? What is the or rather, Soviet Union? What is Russia doing in Ukraine, and why is it moving its troops there? And so there are major theories that explain international relations, and we are going to look into those. Now, this is a very unusual approach. You will probably You're looking at zebras. Yes, zebras. Now, here's a question that I want to ask you, and I want you to not Google this. Just think about what your initial response, instant response would be. Is a zebra white with black stripes, or is a zebra black with white stripes? Okay, let's give this like 10 seconds. Think about it. White with black stripes or black with white stripes? Now, if you ask someone this question and they didn't look it up, you'd probably get all kinds of answers, and I encourage you to do this. So this is what I call perspective, but actually it is. I believe the correct answer is that it's white with black stripes. That's what Google says, or that's what people who study zebras say. But I'm sure you'll hear people who say it's black with white stripes, or it's white with black stripes, or black with white stripes. So perspective is important. How we see things, issues, places, people, things is important. This is an old um, map of how Americans perceive the world, including, I think this was when there was maybe during the Cold War. And we are not really going to talk much about this, but you can sort of see how people might perceive different places. Uh, this is another perspective of how apparently most Americans see this is actually during the Cold War. Um, and so, even though this is simplistic, the question is, how do we see the world? Do we see the world as a kind, hopeful place, or do we see it full of threats? Um, it's very interesting when you study American leaders' speeches, when they always say to protect our people, and they don't really mean protect them from hockey and bears, or elephants and lions. Um, so this is a perspective as to how people see the world, and this is really important. So, thinking about how we perceive the world and how we explain the world, we come to theories of international relations. Now, we can't explain the whole world with theories of IR. And so, a lot of times, you'll also hear me exchange with IR theories, theories of international relations theories. Some people abbreviate this as IRT, IR theories. So theory, just generally defined, is defined as a coherent group of tested general propositions, commonly regarded as correct, and can be used as principles of explanation and prediction of a class of phenomena. So coherent, they are actually well thought out. Tested general propositions. I am going to put a bid on the tested because some things you cannot test. Last class we talked about mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction is actually a theory. I'm not sure that you want to test that, because we all maybe also Terminator, and yeah, that didn't end well for humans. Commonly regarded as correct, principles of explanation or prediction. So theories can explain or they can predict. So for example, if you see that countries that have populations living in other countries generally invade the second country, then for example, now you can predict maybe Russia will invade Ukraine. And they explain a class of phenomena. So a class of phenomena here, for example, would be wars. They could be economic development, human rights, any class of phenomena that you're seeking to explain. They are also defined as proposed explanations whose status is still conjectural. So you can actually create a theory. Um, in At some point we had mentioned the theory of aggression that was used to increase exports of lingerie from the US to USSR, or at least was intended to. And so sometimes you can test theories, you can experiment. Yeah, in international relations, there are conceptual frameworks and theories that help understand events, phenomena, and analyze policies and practices. So, for example, in international relations, what happens when a country is attacked by another? You can come up with a theory that suggests that any country that is attacked by a second country will generally go to war. And you can look at, for example, the US and Japan during the Second World War, the US and Afghanistan during 9/11. But then you can also see the other side, for example, the US and Iraq in 2003. But also, if you think about Hitler's invasion of Poland and Czechoslovakia, this was unprompted. So, but the idea is that theories do help us explain phenomena. Now, so that's theory, and theories will contain a dependent and independent variable or explanatory variables. So, for example, if you're trying to explain war, um, what explains war? Now, I'm going to try to not move us into 333 and methods, but always think about what explains a phenomenon, what explains war. And so war here is a dependent variable. What are the independent variables? What are the things that can explain war? Aggressive leaders, um, you know, just dislike for a group of people like Hitler, search for resources, elimination of threats. And so you can look at most wars and make a determination um, what caused that certain phenomena, what explains economic development. And so, for example, economic development, you hear, capitalism is a great thing. Now, if I came up with a theory to say that countries that are doing well economically have at some point violated the human rights of foreign persons through slavery, colonialism, and other related, or just simple exploitation, taking them over, taking oil and so on, it is possible to support those positions. So theories help us to explain phenomena. We generate hypotheses, we can test hypotheses, we can falsify statements, so we can say whether something is supported or it's not. Please note that we can never prove that something is true, um, including the things that we think we can prove. You can prove someone loves you, for example. Um, Now, good theories are generalizable. They explain events across space and time. So, for example, if you could come up with a good explanation of why war happens, that's a good theory. Um, Now, Darwin's theory of evolution is cited as a good example, but also sometimes theories don't explain everything all the time, but also sometimes there are differences. So, for example, it is known that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. But does water always boil at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit? It does not always do that, because it depends on whether there's impurities in the water. It depends on on where you are. So, for example, at sea level, yes, it boils. Pure water at sea level boils at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you actually need to make these distinctions. That theories will work sometimes in places and other times not. Um, so, dependent variables, this is more explanatory information. And so, for example, Darwin's theory is powerful, it's tested, it's logically correct. And there's a whole methods part to how we create theories and test theories and so on, but we are not going to go into that. So, but I'm going to mention that, for example, today we think of E is equal to mc squared as tested or at least factual knowledge. But is it? Yeah, that's a good question. But also think about something like atoms being the smallest unit of matter. But are they? Or when Higgs boson is actually discovered, or when we split the atom someday, are we then going to change everything that we knew? And so knowledge is not always factual. Think about the geocentric versus heliocentric models. One believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and then suddenly we knew that it was not, and that the the sun is the center of our universe. But now we know that there are many universes and galaxies and so on. And so knowledge by design is cumulative. It keeps on growing, and we keep on discovering new things. Now, but going back to international relations theories, there are things that are common across most of the theories. So, for example, across most of the theories, we shall see that they recognize the state. The state is important. That states also act as rational unitary actors. So, as I mentioned before, we don't talk about Republicans invading Iraq or Afghanistan. We talk about the United States. The idea of a unitary actor is that the state acts as a unit, even if you have dissenting voices. For example, we don't know if there are dissenting voices in China, Russia, North Korea, but we say North Korea did this. Unitary actor. Rational, it's the idea that you are actually thinking about what you're about to do, and that you think it's the best thing since the invention of sliced bread. Now, there's a whole part to rationality, which includes, for example, if and this applies even to human beings. If you have a decision to make, you go through a process of, I have a decision to make. I want to make the best decision. These are some of the possibilities. These are some of my options. You calculate the cost and benefit of each, and then you, in theory, if you're a rational actor, you make the decision that most benefits your interests. This is not, sometimes we do see people who make decisions and we are thinking, why would you do that? But to them, there's some rationality to that. So unitary rational actors, that international institutions are there. Now, institutions are seen as either rules or the actual organization. So, for example, you can say the United Nations is an institution, but you can also say that the United Nations is cooperation as it's an institution that is made up of rules: who can vote, who cannot vote, how many delegations or delegates you can send to the UN, those kinds of things. And so international institutions are sets of rules that govern international behavior or behavior of states to other states. Rules can also be organization. I mean, they are rules, statements that allow or forbid actions, but they are also, as I mentioned, the structures themselves, the organization itself. So you can have the UN, you can have the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UN or Vienna Convention that governs the treatment of diplomats. Now we do see other actors within international relations theory. So for example, multinational companies, multinational corporations or MNCs. So for example, Apple is an MNC, McDonald's. These are other actors. Now we have identified another category of actors that are not states or organizations, or they are organized, and we call these violent non-state actors, VNSAs, violent non-state actors, terrorists, criminal gangs that have an effect. So think about, for example, the smuggling that often happens in Mexico, or the area around Honduras, Guatemala, and so on. So you have criminal organizations that do these things, or that traffic narcotics, or even terrorists. These are what we call the violent non-state actors. Now, individuals can also be important, and they can have an impact on international relations and international politics. And so sometimes it's individual leaders, sometimes it's, and sometimes they affect international relations, sometimes they affect the leaders of countries. We talked about briefly Dennis Rodman, and or whether Kanye West was going to Russia and what that might mean. And so we do see these actors, individuals. So the international system, we also see the international system in terms of theories. So there's an international system that regulates what countries can do and what they cannot do. So for example, if you think of the Iran nuclear deal, the idea was that a group of countries was going to limit what Iran could do with nuclear weapons. Now, this sometimes is seen as flying against in the face of sovereignty, because the idea of sovereignty is you can do what you want, when you want, how you want, within your borders. But countries have determined that maybe you're threatening other countries, and that's not a great thing to do. So there's those kinds of concepts in international relations theories. Identity can be important. So identity of self, beliefs. And so when we talk about democracy, democratic countries identify themselves and each other as guided by certain agreements and ideas. Norms are also related to beliefs and so on. And so collective expectations of proper behavior. So for example, if you're within a group setting, including even within friends, what are the things that are acceptable and what are the things that are not acceptable? And so, again, when someone violates these norms, what happens to them? Same thing with countries. What can countries do? What are accepted norms? How do you treat diplomats, for example? These are the kinds of norms we are talking about. What are the expectations? And do states recognize and respect these norms most of the time? And the idea is that yes, they most of the time they do. So depending on who you ask, there are 3 or 4 major theories of international relations, and these are realism. So this realism and its offshoots. the offshoots of realism include, for example, neorealism, defensive realism, offensive realism. This liberalism and its offshoots, so for example, neoliberal institutionalism, complex interdependence, cooperation, and so even some of these have many theories within them. So, for example, theories of cooperation, we have, for example, decentralized cooperation theory, that countries will cooperate on certain things and not others. Then we have the third theory, that is constructivism, that has other offshoots that include feminism. And then Marxism, which is sometimes considered a theory of international relations, and other people are like, that's not really a theory. And this includes dependency, the idea that there are two groups of countries. There's the haves and the have-nots, the global north and global south, and that even world economic um, activities are structured based on these two haves and have-nots. We also have world systems and the co-periphery idea that is actually related to dependency. And so we'll look at these. I thought to include those two resources because they can be very helpful to, especially Ole Holsti in the definition of the theories, but also Kuhn and how we come to new theories. New theories are continuously being created. And so Thomas Kuhn talks about paradigm shifts and how we believe certain things, and then we find that, oops, what we believe might not actually be true. And so maybe we need to believe some other thing. So the beginning with realism. So realism is the sort of the oldest, the parent theory of all of these theories, and most of its tenets focus on the state and the international system. And so even though it was first specified in E.H. Carr's 20 Years Crisis, which I believe was written in the maybe 30s or 40s, we look back to history of international relations, even though international relations here might be improperly used. But we go back to the history of Peloponnesian War. We looked at this, and so analysis of Thucydides' history of Peloponnesian Wars gives us some assumptions. So, for example, that the state is a principal actor, that states are the major actors in international relations. And if you think about it, states are the mostly the only legal entity that has or abrogates the right to actually murder its citizens. It can prevent you from going places. It can basically, the state is the most powerful principal actor. It even if you consider yourself a free spirit and you want to go to a different country or come into this country, you have to get certain documents that are dictated by the state, including, for example, passport. Mention that the state is a unitary actor, acts with one voice, even when there are disagreements within the state. States pursue national interest, and so there's a question of what the national interest is, national interests, and countries define them differently. But for example, the US looks at territorial integrity, sovereignty, security of its people, and so on. But these are the same interests that most other countries have. Security is most important to states, and so states must protect themselves from foreign and domestic enemies. And so most of realists will say there is no one who can protect the state because there's no hierarchy. We'll talk about anarchy, but there's no hierarchy. There's no entity above the state, and the United Nations is not above states, contrary to popular belief. We also mentioned that states are rational actors. Now, did we not? I thought yeah. So realism also assumes anarchy as the ordering principle in international affairs. It's very interesting because anarchy in the context of common usage is lawlessness. But anarchy in the context of international relations is the idea that it's a sort of opposite of hierarchy. There's no authority above states that can tell states what to do. Now, think about the opposite of the hierarchy within states. For example, you have courts, you have police, you have um, governors, you have the executive branch, you have federal authorities. Most of these can sort of tell you what to do, even though we believe that they can't. But we follow laws, we follow rules. If you're driving, you drive on a certain side of the road. If you come to a stop sign, you follow certain. So we are our lives are governed by these rules. But with the international arena, there are no rules that, other than conventions and treaties that countries agree to, and they can get out of this as they like. I don't think you can decide that you're going to drive on the wrong side of the road just because you feel that you don't need to be bound by rules within a hierarchical bureaucracy. And so the idea of anarchy is that there's no central authority above states. There are no rules other than those that states agree to. And even those they sometimes violate. So, for example, China is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but it separates children from their parents, especially the Uyghur Muslims. Um, there's no one to enforce the rules. So if I do something that violates the rules in Norfolk City or at Norfolk State, there's ways to deal with me. These authorities that can deal with me. Internationally, for states, there isn't. Now, further, states can only depend on themselves for their security. And while we may see that the states can call on friends and, uh, sometimes fight other states, really states can only depend on themselves. And so they pursue power so that they are powerful enough in case they are ever attacked. Now, so in pursuing power and what we call self-help, states can only help themselves or they can only depend on themselves. States pursue power by war and conquest. So think of Germany during the Second World War, or balancing acts that are done through treaties and alliances and so on. Now, so anarchy, as previously mentioned, is the absence of a higher governing authority. So there's no central governing authority in the international system. There's no regulation of relations between states other than those which states actually agree on. No supreme executive. So unlike states which have presidents or prime ministers, there's no government above states. Um, and sovereignty, because every state is sovereign in theory, then you can't have an authority over the state. Um, and so the absence of a justice or a mechanism to which you can appeal when your rights and beliefs and ideas are violated makes it so that there is no, it's a self-help world. Now, some people say anarchy isn't necessarily chaos or conflict or fighting. Um, it's almost like saying the sky is blue. The sky being blue is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. And we're going to see how constructivists talk about, whether the sky being blue is a good thing or a bad thing depends on what your preferences are. So, for example, if it's your wedding day and you are having a garden wedding and you needed for the sky to be blue and it's not, then that is not a good thing. But otherwise, the sky is blue. That is what the sky is. So anarchy is not necessarily bad. But according to realism, because there's no authority, who is to prevent states from doing what they want to do? And usually the answer is no. And so the roots of realism go back to the Peloponnesian War, as we mentioned, and those are the four major, well, there's actually many tenets, but these are some of the ones that were identified during the arising from Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. We talk about Thomas Hobbes. So states do, I mean, realism also looks at the nature of the human being, and according to realism, we are selfish people, and so we'll always be trying to look for advantage and the benefit over and above the other people. And so especially with Hobbes, he talks about people in the state of nature have a duty and right to self-preservation, but the state of nature assumes there is no authority, and so that for states as we know them now is not necessarily true. And so the state of nature also assumes that we have the right to use violence against others, which again, when you think about it, that sounds probably like a horrible idea. Now, this is part of the quote from Thomas Hobbes, um, and so when he talks about the absence of a sovereign, it's a time of war. Every man is an enemy to every man. Men live without security. And so in this kind of context, there is no industry, commerce, culture, earth, navigation, knowledge, society. And this is where he talks about the life of man being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But Hobbes' account um, relates to. So basically, his argument is for the Leviathan, the sovereign, the state. Um, and so realism has both addresses itself both to our human nature as being mean, but also when we then form states, we form states that we expect will fight each other all the time, which some admit is not the case. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, we've seen some adaptations to realism, and so but some of the tenets are carried over. One of the major figures of in modern day realism is Hans Morgenthau. He wrote a book, I believe, in 1960, Politics Among Nations, and it's a classic. Absolutely read it. And so he looks at international politics as a struggle for power. Now, sometimes it's useful to think about the context in which scholarship is derived. 1960s is the height of the Cold War. Actually, 1960 to 1970 is seen as one of the coldest parts of the Cold War. Cuban Missile Crisis, the escalations in Vietnam, many other coups. So again, is that a function of the time that they were writing in? And so that the idea that states rely on external balancing, that they favor that most states will pursue absolute gains, not relative gains. And so, it's sort of like if there's a thing, either you have it or I have it, know that we can share it. But so sometimes there are things that maybe can be shared, but maybe hegemony. If you're the most powerful, I don't know that we can be the most powerful. And so if we are thinking about a world in which it's every man for himself, then you kind of see that absolute gains, it's sort of like I have to have everything and you yeah. Now, we briefly talked about the security dilemma, which is an element of realism. And the security dilemma is the idea that, because it's an anarchic world, I can't trust the intentions of the other state. So remember my example with the neighbors. Your neighbor goes out and buys a gun and starts shooting pigeons in their yard, and you don't have good relations with them, and so they're thinking, are you practicing for me? So this leads to the security dilemma where then your response is, I'm going to get myself a bigger gun. And so then the next time I see with a bigger gun, I'm going to be thinking, maybe I should get two bigger guns. And so this is what prompts the arms race. So maybe looking at the world as a mean, maybe selfish place doesn't exactly help the prospects for peace. So we also see other concepts that are related to realism, for example, internal balancing. So you can balance internally, build your own capabilities, or balance externally. So for example, countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are protected under the umbrella of NATO. And so now we did question whether that makes them more reckless in their dealings with other places and countries, but that can give you security to know that you're not going to be attacked by your enemies. But some people also argue that that gives you countries such as those that are protected by alliance umbrellas sometimes do risky things, which can be seen, for example, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you study the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's allegations that are made that Castro was urging the Soviet Union to fight the US, which probably would have been a very bad outcome for both the US and USSR, but also for Cuba, because that's where the Soviet missiles were. And so maybe this external balancing can be a challenge. Now, bandwagoning is generally considered to be aligning with a stronger third, especially with a stronger other country. Think, for example, of Ukraine in the current crisis with Russia. So Ukraine probably can take on Russia by itself, but by aligning itself with the West and NATO and so on, then there's better chances of, if there's a conflict, then maybe Ukraine's lot will not be super terrible. And so this is somewhat akin to alliances, even though this is not necessarily formal. But again, does bandwagoning make countries behave badly because they are supported by powerful countries? And so this is the official security dilemma definition. Actions by one state to ensure its security by increasing or improving its military strength, including entering into alliances, may lead other states to feeling threatened and responding with similar measures. And so, whenever you increase your capabilities, and I know, then I increase mine, and we're in an arms race. And unfortunately, this can create war, because at some point it's going to be like you're going to misinterpret or misunderstand the intentions of the other, and then right there you have the beginnings of a conflict. So it's important to, I think, keep these things in mind. The definitions of absolute gains, relative gains, security dilemma. So briefly, offshoots of realism. One of the most important offshoots of realism is neorealism, or what is generally referred to as structural realism. And so the one of the differences is that instead of attributing conflict and other related issues to individuals and our pessimistic nature and states and their thinking about fighting, neorealism adds another layer to this. It recognizes those. So, for example, the characteristics of states and human nature, but neorealism adds the international system and structures of international system, because clearly these are United Nations. There are international organizations like the European Union, the African Union, NAFTA, which is now USMCA, and other organizations. And so you can't ignore this. And over time, we have seen them come together and do certain things. And so neorealism points to this as an additional important feature. So not only does it look at the persons, the nature of us as human beings and our role, it also looks at the characteristics of the state, but also the international system. So it's a sort of three-level analysis lenses, but it also looks at the distribution of power, which include unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, and I think they left out the interpolar. So many different poles that are sufficiently strong. Now, so this is one of the key offshoots of realism, neorealism. And so Waltz wrote this important book, Theories of International Politics, A Theory of International Politics, 1979. And so it's important to, I would encourage you to think about, to definitely look at this book. It's one of the modern marvels. And so to summarize realism and neorealism, the key actor is states. Now, note we say key actor. So the states are most powerful. And his argument is that, you know, individuals can't do the things states can do to you. Neither can the international system. And so, for example, the UN is limited in what it can do. States are the most important. In fact, he argues that states actually form international organizations. Now, individuals, he does mention that are insecure, selfish, and power-seeking, and so are states, unitary actors, rational. They act in the national interest. They protect sovereignty in their territory and people. The international system is anarchic, and therefore because there's nothing to stop war, there's always the threat of war. Um, because there's no um, because there's no power over states, he believes that there's no possibility of perpetual peace, no matter what other people might say. Um, and so he doesn't think, unlike liberalism or constructivism, that we can actually achieve peace among states, which is very yeah. So the major theorists include Thucydides, Hobbes, Morgenthau, Waltz. Gilpin has a new sort of realism that is interesting, and John Mearsheimer. Now, as I mentioned, these offshoots of realism, which include offensive and defensive realism. Offensive realism is because you can't know what the other state is intending, you increase your own capabilities. Um, and so you improve um, your own position of power, including by sometimes alliances with a known threat. Now, offensive realism might also include invading other people so that you become more powerful. So if you think about what Germany was doing in the First World, actually the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, and the Second World War, that is an example of offensive realism. And so if you invade one country, like um, like what happened with the Anschluss with Austria, then Czechoslovakia was intimidated into actually agreeing to Germany taking over parts of Czechoslovakia. But then this essential offensive realism that then threatened Poland by invasion kind of backfired. But this is a really good example of offensive realism. Defensive realism includes postures that include, for example, military, diplomatic, and economic postures that don't threaten other states, and so states will not invade. And so, if you think about something like China strengthening itself internally, but not necessarily threatening other than Taiwan, perhaps. Um, so, if someone asked you of all the characteristics of realism, these are it. Anarchy, the world is anarchic. States are the principal key actors. They are unitary actors, they are rational actors. They are security conscious. They cannot trust others, and so they can only depend on helping themselves, self-help. They always pursue power, both as a means to acquire their interests, but also as an end. Power by itself is important to states, and they seek it. Um, States are power maximizers. In other words, they're going to try to find an advantage in every way they can. Think about what China has been accused of doing with intellectual properties, especially around the US or companies. And so this is an example of power maximizing, whether it's military, economic, or alliances, even though in China's case, it's only seeming to do this economically through, for example, the Bridge and Road Initiative, but also when it builds islands in the South China Sea, the Spratlys, and militarizes them. You can see this as an example of power maximizers. Now, states' preferences are seen as unchanging. In other words, all states are seen as having the same interests: self-preservation, self-help, power, those kinds of things. States are always seen to be vigilant because apparently they believe that conflict is a recurring problem. Conflict will always recur, and therefore conflict will always recur, and therefore states can only keep an eye out on their neighbors and adversaries, and yeah. Now, even though we see this realism being a little pessimistic, it's important to mention what is called shadow of the future. Shadow of the future refers to the length of interactions that a state is going to have with another state, or an actor is going to have with another actor. So think of it this way. In your case, what is the shadow of the future? What is your shadow of the future at Norfolk State? If you're graduating in May and don't intend to ever return, then your shadow of the future is 3 months long. If you think about the shadow of the future, for example, between the US and Canada, one assumes they are always going to be there next to each other. And so it seems that the most feasible thing to do would be to get along with each other, because unless all the northern states secede, you're not going to have a different country. There are very few instances in which country borders change, except maybe Yugoslavia and South Sudan. And so most states, if they are not fighting, sometimes want to have a good relation, because they're going to always be next to each other. And so even though realism suggests that states will likely fight and will probably likely fight their neighbors, there is a question of whether that is maybe the best approach. Now, realism also briefly talks about institutions, whether they are organizations or the rules. And so they talk about possibility of mitigating conflict, however, that states can be manipulated by strong states, that institutions cannot replace states as main actors, because actually states create institutions, and it's very difficult to create something that replaces you, other than maybe robots. institutions can rarely get states to back down. And so if you think about the UN, the famous Colin Powell appearance before the UN Security Council, or was it the General Assembly, arguing for the case of invading Iraq, um, the UN could not get the US to not invade Iraq. And so, but there are those who say that it depends on the power of the particular state. Um, so cooperation, the anarchy does recognize cooperation, but it depends on what issue area it is. So for example, even adversaries like the US and Russia will generally cooperate on matters that relate to space. And so, but there will be other places and times in which they absolutely will not see eye to eye on anything. And so, for example, if you think about current disagreements on Ukraine, you do see this idea of cooperation on issues, on some issues and not others. There's also the assumption that institutions are created by strong states in order for them to manipulate those the interests and the issues that are deliberated by the institutions. And this actually sort of makes sense because you kind of want to have a hand in everything that is happening, and if you're not in the institution, then you are sort of on the outside. A very good example is given of the Soviet Union during the vote at the Security Council in 1950 over whether the UN could authorize actions in Korea. The Soviet Union actually walked out of the meeting, and the US led a vote. The vote that was taken affirmed that the UN could initiate military actions in North Korea. Now, if the Soviet Union had stayed and voted no, we probably wouldn't have had a Korean War, because that would have been essentially what we call a veto. So now, the other sort of lessons from realism: people are selfish, they compete with others. Lust for power drives people to want to dominate other people, and I think these are generally true. It's impossible to eradicate the lust for power. International politics is a war of all against all. I don't know if that's true. Every state promotes the national interest as an obligation. Anarchy leads to states to prepare constantly for war. Economic growth is important, so this is sort of the mercantilist argument, and it contributes to military strength. Allies can be helpful at times, but cannot be relied on. IOs and IGOs and international law cannot be relied on to protect the state, so the state can only protect itself using the force of arms, and that balance of power helps maintain peace. Now, so that's realism. Pessimistic, somewhat accurate, one of the major theories of international relations. Now, the second theory is liberalism, and this originates in ancient Greeks. So again, you do see some of the same arguments. Human beings, individuals are rational, they understand basic laws of nature, even though they might be maybe self interested, and that they want to pursue power and so on. So, but there's also assumptions that people want to improve. People want to improve and have the capacity to improve their conditions by creating a just society through cooperation with other people. That institutions that might be inadequate are the causes of war, not something that is inherently within the international system, contrary to what realism suggests. Now, so through the ages, we do see certain theorists and philosophers advocating these ideas. So especially Enlightenment thinkers come up with these ideas, for example, of the non-defectiveness of human nature, that as human beings we are not necessarily defective. It's the institutions that we form that are probably more responsible for conflict than it is our nature. War is a product of society, and it's not attributable to human beings. Now, I probably did mention that one of the things that realism says is that um, the society actually prepares, especially men, young men, to fight. It prepares them. Think about warriors. Think about how we treat soldiers, the military, that we actually socialize, especially young men, to fight. So this is kind of opposite of what liberalism is saying, that war is a product of society, not something that is inherent in us. Realism says, oh yeah, it's inherent in us. We are built to fight. Think of the NFL. Okay, I went there, and maybe I should not criticize football. But we also see other individuals like Immanuel Kant, whose major contribution, well, actually many contributions, but in Ewiges Frieden, which is perpetual peace, he talks about what would be the perfect solution to reduce war among states, and uh, he talks about the international society. Possibilities of peace based on three conditions: reciprocity, identity, and international organizations, and so on. But we also see other, I have brought up Woodrow Wilson as maybe a good internationalist, but yeah, his humanity was questionable, at least in some respects. But he was very a great advocate of international collectivist actions. So including collective security, dealing with collective security through the groups of, or rather, through a group of nations agreeing, and this was the impetus for the League of Nations. The idea that rationality and social nature of humans, that we can actually eradicate war because we would rather socialize than fight, which sometimes is well supported. Working through groups and learning, education, developing institutions that are less likely to promote conflict. These were seen as viable approaches to finding peace. And so these are essentially elements of the liberal tradition. But so neoliberal institutionalism is really about institutions, about rules, about codification of expectations of behavior, conduct, and so on. And so we see it beginning in the 1970s, not because that's when it started, but when as you might remember, the League of Nations failed. So nobody really had much hope for the United Nations, although then the United Nations actually began to do the things that the League could not do. And so we are beginning to see people study institutions as organizations and rules that are actually valid. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, we also see Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, who actually was an undersecretary of state, I believe, in the Clinton administration. He is also credited with coining the term soft power. But so together they come up with this idea of complex interdependence, that the world is not as simple as we are going to fight or not fight, that the world is complex, that there will be areas of cooperation and areas of non-cooperation. And so this is what they begin to define as complex interdependence. When do we cooperate and when do we not cooperate? So these are issues that they are studying, that states are connected through multiple channels. And as I mentioned, space cooperation in space is actually one of the areas that has endured all these other disagreements, because even during the Cold War, you saw American and Soviet astronauts doing spacewalks together, those kinds of things. And so maybe we are not inherently warlike, and maybe we can cooperate, even when in some areas we do not always agree. So these multiple channels are important according to Cohen and Nye, and that we can cooperate through those channels. Now, that defense, that the use of military force has actually declined, and this is actually true. Steven Pinker, I believe is his name, records that armed conflict is actually on the decline overall. And so maybe we can cooperate more than fight. So I've mentioned the shadow of the future. We shall not go back to that. But so think about shadow of the future and where it appears. For example, interactions with each other across issues. When you are a member of the European Union, you interact across issues and time. You create international treaties that outline expectations through repeated interaction. So think of it as like if you're attending class and you have a syllabus, and some of the syllabi look the same. There are things you can do and there are things you cannot do. So these repeated interactions create templates for expected conduct, and so they also specify what happens if you don't behave as expected by the group, including sanctioning. And so sometimes you'll hear countries are kicked out of things. Russia, after invading Crimea in 2014, was kicked out of G8, the group of 8 most powerful nations. And so it hasn't met, even though the previous US president had stated he was going to invite Russia to participate in the G8. Now, of course, the G8 really is not, it's not like they actually have a job. But most of the time, nobody wants to be kicked out of the cool kids club. And so that's kind of what the G8 was. And so if you are kicked out, it's sort of like, whoops, what did you do to get kicked out? And so this prestige and those kinds of things. But so repeated interactions, including, for example, USMCA, the new NAFTA, or the European Union, specify expectations for interactions. Now, so in terms of a summary of what is important, the key actors in neoliberal institutionalism are, of course, states, but also international organizations, IOs. Well, so we have international organizations, international governmental organizations, but even non-governmental organizations. So, for example, the Ottawa protocols for the removal of landmines were actually they involved very much non-governmental organizations. The International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, involved a lot of input from non-governmental organizations that have been working in helping people in conflict areas. And so it's not just states, or it's not just the primacy of states as realism suggests. There's also the question of other groups, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and so on. Liberalism also believes that people are basically good, and that we can cooperate and actually achieve things. States are rational, they have relationships, friendships, and rivalries. And so if you think about, for example, the US and Canada, the US and Mexico, you do see that there's quite a bit of friendships. Actually, some of the states that have some of the most enduring friendships are to be found in Africa. You find very few interstate wars, wars between states. Um, so states can be democratic, liberal, or authoritarian, but also this, there's no, it's not necessarily the case that democratic nations are more peaceful, especially towards non-democracies, despite democratic peace theory. So um, state characteristics are important, even though we haven't seen, for example, autocratic nations fight each other more just because they are autocratic. Actors within states can influence state actions, and this might include, interest groups and so on. So this becomes important. The international system, while um, while neoliberal institutionalism acknowledges that there is no government above other governments, that is sort of the whole statement of the sky is blue. Um, yes, there's no government above other governments, but that doesn't mean that states need to fight. Because institutions, the structure that is created by institutions, the rules, leads to possibilities of cooperation and peace. And so they start, and maybe we should give some more credence to the possibilities of peace through neoliberal institutionalism. Now, some of the major theorists, this is probably not super important, but if you create a theory, and we are going to know you from that, but Montesquieu, Kant, Woodrow Wilson, Cohen, and Moravcsik are important. So there are other sub-liberal theories. Some are arguments and concepts and approaches. And so some of these include, for example, the second image reversed, the idea that there are domestic sources of non-cooperation or cooperation, or the bottom-up view of cooperation. And so sometimes cooperation is determined by who is ruling. If you think about the US, for example, withdrawing from some of the major international agreements during the previous presidency, and then this current presidency returning to those things, including, for example, the Paris Climate Accords, um, the restoring the funding for the World Health Organization. So again, sometimes leaders can influence what states can do. Um, yeah, and so the substance and depth of cooperation, according to Gurevich, sometimes depends on the constellation of states' preferences. So this is where it's important whether, for example, a state is led by conservatives or by liberals. One of the most interesting American experience, or rather examples, is the Mexico City policy. So the Mexico City policy relates to funding for contraceptive access to contraception in developing countries. Almost every Republican administration comes in and stops funding for the Mexico City policy. Almost every Democratic administration comes in and restores the funding for the Mexico City policy. So you can sort of see how states' preferences, or within, so states' preferences here might be interpreted as uh, political parties. So I mentioned the democratic peace theory, otherwise called the golden arches theory, um, that no two democracies, while they were democracies, have ever gone to war with each other. Um, Now, it's important to think about what a democracy is. The People's Republic of Korea defines itself as, well, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That's not the kind of democracy we are talking about. We are talking about liberal democracies, that are identified as so by, indices such as Polity4, which is a data set, or the Freedom House, which I am suspicious of. But democratic peace theory, no two democracies, while they were democracies, have ever gone to war with each other. Now, I don't know how you feel about India and Pakistan, which have gone to war with each other 3 times. But the question of whether Pakistan is a democracy is out there. There's a commercial, another theory of commercial peace, that economic interdependence decreases the likelihood of conflict. Actually, the realism argument is the opposite. That the more you interact with people, the more you disrespect them, and the more likely you are to fight them, or them to fight you. So maybe repeated opportunities for interactions. Now, the question of membership in international institutions are seen to have a positive effect on cooperation. And so different factors, including those that provide insight into state behavior, how they influence international politics, assumptions of rationality, cooperation, possibilities of cooperation, and so on. But so we do have those kinds of liberal theories that are not necessarily neoliberal institutionalism. But so to summarize liberalism, some assumptions include that human nature is good, progress is possible, inadequate institutions cause war, conflict and war are not inevitable, and actually institutions can reduce them. War is a global problem and it requires collective multilateral factors and actors. Morality should be part of politics. Realism says, morality, what morality? That institutions that make war more likely should be eliminated. So, for example, if it's a security alliance that makes war more likely, then maybe it should be eliminated. And so it's interesting to think about what neoliberal institutionalism would say about Ukraine's desire to join NATO and how that has brought the world to the current crisis we are in. There's a preference for democracy over aristocracy because then the will of the people are seen as less willing to go to war. But also free trade is preferred over mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that every economic activity is mostly directed and benefits the state. Now, neoliberal institutionalism or liberal institutionalism also has some thoughts on institutions. And so even while acknowledging that there's no government above governments, liberalism does argue that institutions provide a forum for state interactions, and so you're interacting with many states. It increases transparency because there are norms and rules that bind states. It decreases transaction costs. So if you're going to negotiate something about climate change and you go to Paris and all of you are talking about what you're going to accept, instead of negotiating with every other state, which would be 100 and maybe 92 agreements, if you can get all of those, you have one agreement to which a group of states will sign on to. That institutions provide interaction templates and clarify expectations, that these are the rules, these are what the possibilities, this we will do, this we will not do. That they decrease conflict and tension due to similar expectations, that they aggregate expectations, they increase cooperations, they temper anarchy, they decrease the likelihood of conflict. And so those are some of the assumptions. Other assumptions that while states are, yes, the most important actors in international system, there are other actors such as IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, regional trade associations, non-governmental organizations, and multinational corporations. That there's interdependence among states, that changes in the international system interact with and change states' preferences. So, for example, if there is a move towards reduction of nuclear proliferation, this may change states' behaviors or preferences towards those kinds of things. That intergovernmental organizations can change state preferences, that states are guided by morals and ethos of international system, that international system provides a common forum in a template for interactions, increasing transparency, decreasing the costs, increasing cooperation, and decreasing conflict. So again, these are things that can and have been shown to be true in and through liberalism. Now, constructivism is a third theory, and so constructivism is a more late 20th century addition to international relations. It's important to understand that sometimes theories arise from the previous theories not being able to explain the occurrences in international politics or international relations, or just asking the question, is this the whole spectrum of is this everything? And so according to constructivism, state behavior is shaped by beliefs, identities, and social norms. And we did mention, for example, the reality that nuclear weapons, when they explode, they explode. They don't, they explode, and that's kind of what they do and kill people. And so we can socialize the world to shun nuclear weapons or even weapons of mass destruction. Constructivism also believes that individuals forge and shape and change culture through ideas and practices. So Gorbachev, for example, came and talked about glasnost and perestroika, and suddenly the USSR is going to a different sort of reality. Interests at all levels are socially constructed. So, for example, think about the environmental movement. So there are those people who believe that we are ruining the planet. There are those farmers who are like, okay, maybe there's something about this climate change, and so we can't plant crops unless we regulate this climate situation. So different interests might converge to come to the same outcome, but there are interests at all different levels, and these are important. You can't just dismiss them and say it's a state, it's a monolithic block of cheese. That national interests are ever changing, and so this is actually true. Well, maybe they change a little. So for example, if you think about the US national interest during the Cold War, one of the key things was we cannot have communism. Communism cannot spread. Now it's not communism is not, it's an issue, but it's not like oh, we have to stop communism. But so state preferences and interests may change based on things like technology. In the 1950s, nobody was talking about cyber hacking or hacking infrastructure that is mostly now regulated by computers. So again, you can't be stuck in the interests don't change. I don't think you can, because clearly they are changing. But they're also a result of social identities and technological changes. People in their discourse bring meanings to material structures. And so material structures are important, but we bring meaning to them. And this is really well illustrated by, for example, the nuclear weapons situation, because they do the same thing. It's how we interpret who has them that changes how we feel about them. That international organizations can socialize states and individuals to certain norms, but also that constructivism is not a core, it's not a theory, a unitary theory. It's more like a questioning of what we now hold to be true. So constructivism, as relating to power and change, talks about power existing in every exchange, whether it's as simple as you buying something, there's a power dynamic there. being in class, there's a power dynamic. Whether it's, for example, the US and Mexico, there's a power dynamic playing out there. And so ideas and identity are the sources of this power situation. But constructivism also came up, well, actually, suggests of the idea of soft power. Now, soft power is the idea of persuasion. Now, why is China so unhappy that Western diplomats are boycotting the Olympics? I mean, they are not playing, it's the Olympians who are playing. But so the perception that it's not a human rights observer rankles it. And so this is an example of soft power. You want to attract people, and in fact, soft power has gained a lot of currency. This is, if you think about the Peace Corps, the Peace Corps is the best example of soft power. You send Americans to different countries, and the theory is that they'll talk about American stuff, and that is attractive to other people, and therefore America is attractive to them. But so it's the idea that you can attract other countries by the example of your society. I'm not certain how well this works or if it works, but um, this is one of the issues that has been um, significantly highlighted. Now, so soft power is the power to attract others by the power of your country, economy, ideas, and so on. Smart power, so soft power emerged as an antithesis of hard power, which included just military capabilities and um, military capabilities and economic capabilities. Now, smart power actually includes both hard power and soft power. You attract people, but you also have the capability to back up your attraction with military force. But the most important definition of the illustration of constructivism is that anarchy is what states make of it. Anarchy is not necessarily conflict. The sky is blue, literally. And that's neither good nor bad. It doesn't have to lead to anything. That change in international relations occurs through socialization and diffusion of ideas. Sovereignty is contested, and so if you think about what you watch on TV or on your phone today, um, nations generally no longer have the capacity to control what you watch and how you watch it and those kinds of things, which happened a lot. Well, China still does actually. Uh, but you can have interests that are outside of the country. And so the state today is actually challenged by many things, including, for example, the internet. Um, I usually ask students what is the biggest community in the world, and usually between the Roman Catholic Church and Facebook, you can sort of see Mark Zuckerberg, however you feel about him, has a constituency of more than 2 billion. There's no country with 2 billion people. So again, think about how diffusion of control has occurred. Change can occur through diffusion of ideas, and I usually say if Mark Zuckerberg wanted to send a message to the whole world, he can. Um, I don't know anyone else who can do that without actually doing something destructive. And so diffusion of ideas or internationalization of norms through socialization. And so you identify as different things. You might identify as a humanist, as a feminist, and so these are usually generally global ideas. Now, so constructivism is gaining some increased recognition as a way of trying to understand the world and not just as criticism. Now, one of the international relations critiques that is found in constructivism is feminism. And so, in this particular context, the the question was asked by Cynthia Weber and J. Ann Tickner, among others: is the world constructed by men, and would it be more just, more peaceful, and more prosperous if more women had chances to define, describe, and lead domestic and international affairs? Would the world be different? Now, that's a good conjecture. We don't know. And so a lot of times when we think about these questions, now, first, I think this is my private opinion, but I think the world is too is full of testosterone in a way that is not helpful. Like, we sometimes need to tone it down and talk to each other and maybe not threaten to fight. And so, would leadership by women possibly do this? Now, remember, only about 9% of the world is led by women, even though they are more than 51% of the world's population. So maybe there's a good question there. But when we address these questions, we then revert to should we, if we look at people who have been leaders that are women, Margaret Thatcher, for example, in the West, the US almost did have one. And so we kind of have to ask, how was Margaret Thatcher different as a female leader from other male leaders, and whether she had to act more masculine because she was living in a masculine world. But also you have to think about the reality of interactions with world leaders in countries where women's rights are not, and I'm looking at Saudi Arabia. But so the objective of constructivism, especially feminist critiques of international relations, is how exclusion of women in discussions about international affairs has affected the world and maybe created a more hostile, ready to fight world. How gender identity shapes foreign policy decision making. Are men primed to fight, and therefore when there's a situation they feel like they have to fight? Can greater participation of women in international affairs lead to a more peaceful world? Now, we are not necessarily saying women are more peaceful, and we are not saying they are. But this question of, is international relations, does it mirror what the world looks like? And clearly it does not. But we do see many competing feminisms, including even in international relations, which might say, remove all the men leaders, let women lead, and let's see if we don't have a perfect world. So these are questions of, yeah, and so I would prefer to maybe think about how feminist critiques influence international relations, particularly when you think about radical feminism that emphasizes overarching patriarchy that permeates the national and international norms and that impacts outcomes, and whether if we had more women leaders, this would change. But also liberal feminism, which suggests that men and women act the same way, that because states may not have interests separate from others, then even female leaders would act the same way, which is actually sort of defended in Thatcher's declaration of war against Argentina. So maybe having women different is, as leaders, is not necessarily a different thing. We probably don't know. And so we do see some offshoots, including the Grotian school and critical theory, which is part of which is advanced by David Held, who talks about complexity, that the world interactions take place under complexity, the whole is greater than sum of its parts. The Grotian school actually emphasizes institutions. They are not saying they are not pawns, they are their own individuals, actors, and probably as important as states. And when you think about countries like Afghanistan, sometimes the international institutions are the only things that really make a difference in people's lives. And so, can you then say they are not important, or are we dismissing their lives? Now, so this offshoots to constructivism, but there's also ideas about constructivism, including whether we are socialized by ideas. This is the idea of epochs. The idea that we are now, that there have been three recent epochs: Hobbesian, which is an enmity; Lockean, which is rivals; and now we are in a friendly reality, maybe. Um, I'm not necessarily sold on the epochs part. Now, so Alexander Wendt, one of the best known constructivists, and so again, remember, constructivism is a family of theories, including postmodernism, new Marxism, and feminism. And we are not going to go back there, but it's important to think about where Wendt and some of the ideas that we see that are crossing through Wendt, Walt, and realism and constructivism, that this anarchy, including even in constructivism, states can fight, states can't be sure about others, but that we can see elements of states cooperation because it's how we define cooperation. Now, in constructivism, the summary, the key actors are people, elites, cultures, ideas, especially ideas, the characteristics of individuals. Um, Actors give meaning to material structures. They are bound by education, socialization, and culture, and identity matters. So even though Kim Jong-un is doing the things that he is doing, he was educated in Switzerland, and I don't think then he was, maybe he was still a communist. Um, but so socialization can be important. Um, the states are socially constructed through discourse, and the identities matter. And so you have seen those questions, including, for example, what America is. Is it an immigrant nation of immigrants, or now the international system is also seen as created by the actors within it, but also there are beliefs about change that include change being possible through socialization, through different diffusion of ideas, internationalization of norms, and possibilities of peace, because we can construct a world in which peace is the thing. Now, there's nothing to me that indicates constructivism more than the meaning and what we mean by things. Now, some of them are just annoying and others are actually true. So if you say bat, are you talking about baseball or are you talking about the bird? Now, this is the one that's annoying. Your belongs to you. Your, or you are going home or some other place. But sometimes you may not tell the difference. This gesture is actually an insult in some places. Um, yeah. Now, I'm going to leave this up to you to decide what you see in here. I know you see me. What else do you see? What do you see here? Do you see the illusion? I hope you see the illusion. And something else. Now, this gesture is especially important because, again, you clearly see it depends on where you are for that to have meaning and what it means wherever you are. And so that to me is the best example of what how ideas are constructed and meaning is constructed. Now, the fourth theory is the radical perspective or Marxism. And so, as usual, this places more emphasis on economics, the role of economics in explaining international phenomena, so economic systems, classes, but especially multinational corporations are the primary variables because they are in every country probably exploiting, well, at least that's what Marxists would say. And so dependency theory and Marxism are the two major theories. And so, of course, the major argument, capitalism, private interest, control labor and exchanges. And so the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, that also make up the state apparatus. So again, if you think about who is in Congress and whether or not they are not millionaires, they are mostly. And so the idea is that then they make policy that is beneficial to their interests, even in relations with other countries. For example, if they, temporarily labor into the US, do we stop that because we care about American workers, or do we allow it because that is cheap labor? And if I am wealthy and I own farms, I want cheap labor. But anyway, so there's the bourgeoisie who are in power and who determine the economic activities in our country and therefore abroad. That the global system is hierarchical by product of imperialism, and this is actually partly true because some countries were locked into what they are now, which is producers. That the system gives advantage to some people in a country, some organizations, and some nations. I give the example of the best tea in the world, or according to some. No, it's not Lipton, it's British tea. There's quite a number of British teas. But you have to know that the British don't grow any tea. It's imported from Sri Lanka and Kenya and Ethiopia and other places and Uganda. And then it is processed and then sold around the world and labeled British tea. So is this taking advantage of people in places? And so it has been seen historically to impose constraints, including, for example, slavery, colonialism, and so on. And so when you think about the question of Western nations, the dominant states, what is it that they pursue? Markets, trade, those kinds of things. And so the idea is that even things like trade relations are done to benefit the bourgeoisie in developed countries by exploiting developing countries and some of the labor there. Sometimes it feels like this is true when there was a statement made by a previous president that the US should have taken Iraqi oil, and I can't imagine a worse example of exploitation than that, because we thought they went there for democracy and weapons of mass destruction. Now, dependency theory comprises of two sets of states, the dominant states and the periphery states. So dominant and dependent, core and periphery. The poor states are locked into, and this is why we say dependency theory, into dependent relations with richer states. And so the less wealthy, the dependent states send raw materials to the wealthy dominant nations, which is turned into finished products that are then sold back to the dependent nations for higher prices. And so this cycle repeats. And so it's not clear how, well, other than the revolution that Marx advocated for. But so multinational corporations, international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and IFIs, international financial organizations, are controlled by dominant states, which is actually true. And this help maintain those relations. So think about the bananas. If you eat bananas, look at where they come from. This is a dependent relationship. And so most of the theories focus on economic factors. And so politics, although some people believe that politics and war are really economic, it's about resources and those kinds of things. And so they don't think that. But so this is a summary of radicalism in brief. And so social classes, dominant and dominated states. So these divisions, these binary divisions, um, and the characteristics of states and the results of the yeah. Now, dependency theory is not necessarily generally seen as a separate theory, except here McKibben and Mings do see it as. Now, it's useful to think about the application of theory and what best explains. So, for example, what realists will focus on, what liberal institutionalists will focus on might be, for example, the failure of negotiations within the UN or within the framework, or the role of institutions such as NATO and Ukraine's desire to join NATO. Constructivism will also have something to say about, construction of threats. Maybe Russia and Ukraine are the same country and they're just trying to unite. Um, Now, there's a bit of a background here that includes the expansion of NATO, but this will be also in the PowerPoints that I'm going to attach to this. So there are these contending theoretical perspectives that I think are important for us to keep in mind, that include the liberalism, neoliberalism, realism, radicalism, and constructivism, that summarize the key actors, how they view the individual, how they view the state, um, and the international systems and their beliefs on change. Now, I know this is a lot. It's 2 hours of stuff maybe, um, and so this might require a bit of digesting to think about what are the theories, what are the key tenets, how do they differ from the other theories, and more importantly, where would you stand as relates to these theories? Which of them is the most persuasive to you? So this is something we shall hopefully discuss in future. Thank you for your attention.